Thank you very much indeed for those kind words, Svetlana. Goodness. Following Gordon's presentation is going to be pretty demanding. It's late in the afternoon, so you're going to be feeling very tired. I hope my presentation can maintain your interest in the way that Gordon's presentation maintained mine. Very many thanks for this kind invitation to present to the conference. Over the 6 years of its support to NIS schools and Nazarbayev University, Cambridge has been privileged to support the nation's strategy to improve its educational provision. Today, I'm going to talk about the past and the future. You know, I really enjoyed and respected the young students' performance at the opening of the conference, because my presentation will reflect exactly the balance of cultural heritage and modern thought which we saw in the performance. Indeed, its balance of highly developed ancient skills and its extremely effective communication of complex modern ideas. Kuliash Shamshadinova spoke clearly about the challenges which the future presents and the role which carefully developed education can play in preparing young people for the personal and social challenges that future economy and future society contains. My presentation will not suggest that the educational practices of the past were infallible, but it will argue that we need to understand some important aspects of previous educational practice. I will argue that this past practice is deeply embedded in the professional activities of teachers and head teachers. We will need to dig deep to understand it. Rather unfashionably, I will argue against naive futurology. I reject the arguments of naive futurologists whose obsession with uncertainty gives us and children a kind of constructed anxiety. Their analyses often are built on an irrational rejection of any consideration of the past, and thus, perhaps without realizing it, they reject important aspects of educational practices which have carefully been built up over decades, and in some cases, centuries. And some of my examples will illustrate this extremely clearly and succinctly. I will look at some of those accumulated assets. Of course, not all practice from the past is good, but data suggests that some of it is. I will examine how we combine the best of the old with the assets of the new. If we fail to do this, we are not truly scientific. If we succeed in doing it, we'll be doing what Isaac Newton emphasized when he spoke about the accumulation of knowledge. We can see further when we stand on the shoulders of giants. Kuliash is exactly right. We need to recognize the uncertainties of a rapidly changing world, but using the very best practices identified through the best research and built into the kind of robust policy on which NIS bases its actions. Now, those of you who've heard me lecture before know that I don't often read things out because it's pretty boring. But I wanted to be incredibly precise, and that's why I read that particular section of my lecture. Now, let's look at some evidence. This looks really simple. I mean, education should deliver these three things. What could be simpler? Is it simplistic? Too simple. Education should deliver a combination of benefits to the individual, benefits to the economy, and benefits to society. But just stop and think for a moment. We could easily construct a curriculum which meets the desires of young people, but does not deliver what those young people need to participate in economic life. We could design a curriculum which meets the needs of the structure of society, but fails to engage and motivate young people, or give them individually what they need, or distribute those things in an effective way across all young people. You see, it is complex to actually deliver those in the right combination. And you can use those three categories to criticize particular curricula in particular nations at particular times. This is quite a powerful way of looking at education systems. And most of the modern education systems around the world that we have reviewed, and we have the privilege of working in over 170 countries, are focused on the three issues at the bottom. High attainment, but combined with high equity and with high engagement. Not necessarily exclusively always fun, because I accept what Gordon says about the complexity of play, but certainly presented in such a way that it is engaging for the affective and cognitive reasons which Gordon cited. If there's a crisis in education, it's been going on a long time. This is a very powerful quote from Hannah Arendt, because it looks back as well as looking forward. It looks backwards and says, well, actually, we can't just simply reproduce education as it has always existed, because society is mutable, it is constantly changing. And so we can't construct qualifications or curricula with complete authority which we can exert in our schools. And that does give us a tension within our schooling systems. Children have to believe that we are giving them the things that they will need in the future. And we can't be sure what those things are based on a thorough analysis exclusively of the past alone. And that creates this kind of tension. But I do think we need to look backwards as well as forwards, because the data tell us that. And I will put those data up in a moment. The more that we examine education, the more we think about curriculum, the more complex we find that it is. And it is really, really complex. It's complex for policymakers, for the Kazakh government, which is interested in equity, attainment, and engagement. It's difficult for school leaders and system leaders like Kuliash. It's difficult for teachers in the classroom. It's difficult because we know more and more and more about what happens in the educative process. It does indeed range from discipline-specific knowledge, understanding what an electron is, understanding what the unconscious is, understanding what a metaphor is. It ranges from discipline-specific knowledge and understanding those concepts with precision, right the way through affective and dispositional components of a child's experience and a child's psychological makeup. We need to attend to those things which Gordon described, and we need to understand that they're formed in a range of complex settings, not exclusively in school, but that they do affect the behaviour and outcomes of young people in the school setting. This is really, really complex. It means that behavioural strategy in schools needs to be sophisticated. It means that curriculum development needs to be sophisticated. It means that we need to combine didactics and pedagogy in complex ways. But I don't put these things up here arbitrarily. These are all derived from research. You know, David Bridges and John Elliott in the audience will recognize the derivation of many of these. We have really good evidence on number 5, personal dispositions and attitudes. We know that they're not only important because of observational research on young children. We know they're important because of longitudinal studies, following people through their entire life course. In England, we are following through every child who was born in the first week of February of 1958. We followed them right the way through life. We have actually measured things like externalizing behaviour. Externalizing behaviour means things just happen to me, I have no control. That predicts really bad life outcomes. If you have a sense of personal control, that you can formulate things which will enable you to deal with the bad things in your life and capitalize on the good things, that predicts very good life outcomes, both in terms of health and income and relationships around you. Now, the problem is that we now know all of those things relate to performance in school, and all of those need to be encapsulated within curriculum theory. Oh dear, that's really tough. It makes training teachers hard. It makes their job hard. It makes school leaders' job extremely challenging. Because it's not only important to understand what all these things are and understand the scientific basis for them, you've got to decide where to put them in the school curriculum. You've got to decide how best to support them. So you've got all these things, and you've got to decide where to put them. Whether you put them on a Thursday afternoon in a taught subject for 40 minutes, or whether you put them in, for example, the extracurricular elements, some of which are supported by teachers, some of which are not. Or do you depend on the home environment providing them? Well, if you do that, the evidence says that you'll have a real problem with attainment and equity. I'll give you an example. We know that it's very important for children to understand rights and responsibilities in the society in which they're located. So do we teach that on the third Tuesday of the second term of the 10th grade? Or do we make it a felt and lived experience of the institution through formal mechanisms such as a student council, or through informal mechanisms such as the ethos and the lived experience of the school? So we have got a problem. We've got all of those things, and we need to decide where to put them. I mean, this is a difficult job for systems. It's a really difficult job for schools. It's a challenge for school leaders, and it's a challenge for individual teachers. And for centuries, teachers have been responding to this. Their professional practice has had to respond to this necessary complexity. We can hear from what Gordon has presented us with, the voice of this complexity speaking to us from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. It's always been there in education. Now, if we do some transnational analysis, we can find some fascinating examples. As I say, we work in over 170 countries, so we're very privileged in looking at the curriculum frameworks, observing teaching, interviewing teachers, interviewing parents and children. In terms of aim statements, which are very, very influential in some systems, we find some fascinating aims statements in Singapore, Hong Kong, Finland, and Alberta. In Finland and Singapore, these are lived. The aim statements are not just words on a page, they are lived throughout the school system. Ask a Singapore teacher about the aims of the education system as a whole, and that diagram, which puts values at the heart, they will know about it. And they will believe that their experience is based on it. And that's really important. Some systems have underestimated the importance of aim statements and the importance of making sure they are not just words on a page, but they are truly discharged to the experience and practice of professionals. For content, knowing at what age you need to put in conservation of mass or some Shakespeare, well, you can do some really good international comparisons. And when we redeveloped the national curriculum in England in 2010, we had pages and pages and pages of curriculum statements from the best performing systems, which we laid on very, very big tables. And we examined when things were taught and how they were stated. And it was a very, very revealing experience. More on that in a moment. But for methods, pedagogy, didactics and pedagogy in balance, there's some very interesting stuff on models of ability. Because you can look at all the national curricula in the world, but you won't necessarily get out of it the assumptions about children which teachers have in different national systems. What we find is that performance and the presentation of curriculum material, setting and streaming, the arrangement of children, and their attainment differ markedly depending on the model of attainment which is present in the system and present in the implicit and explicit values of teachers. I cannot overemphasize the importance of understanding the model of ability which is present in a classroom, present in a school, and present in an education system. What's remarkable about some systems is that there's a very coherent model of ability which is shared by many, many students and many children, many teachers and many parents. Isabel Nesbitt has spoken very eloquently recently about the importance of the Confucian model. Every child capable of anything, depending on the effort which they put into learning it and the way in which it's presented to them. This is not a trivial issue. Finland is a very interesting little bit of Asia plonked into part of Europe, because most of the teachers in Finland have this Confucian model, but they didn't get it by accident. And I will deal with that a couple of slides in. And it's very important to understand this complexity. And that's the work of Stigler and Stevenson, an excellent work of Bill Schmidt out of Chicago. The work on curriculum coherence and curriculum control, which I've talked about in Kazakhstan before. For assessment, we're beginning to understand now much better the relationship between formative assessment and summative assessment. We understand that just a teacher asking a question of a group of children is formative assessment. In some systems, those questions are very carefully chosen, very carefully crafted. Why are they carefully chosen and carefully crafted? Because they're the questions that reveal children's thinking. They do what Gordon emphasized. They enable the teacher to understand the way in which individual children are thinking. It's not an accident that a teacher in Shanghai will ask a question and then get 5 or 6 answers from the class. The teacher will not give the answer, but then ask the children to compare the different answers that the different children have given, and why one might be closer to what is expected and why others are not. That's assessment. It's embedded in instruction, it's a key part of pedagogy, and it links absolutely to the collection of evidence on children's attainment, which the teacher can then use to fine-tune the lesson and fine-tune the progression of children. Some of those questions should be used in the end assessment. They can appear in the examination. Sometimes the teacher should use questions from final assessments. It's quite interesting. I use questions which are in examinations for our 16-year-olds. I use these questions with very, very young children. I use questions for 14-year-olds with 5 and 6-year-olds. Because some of these questions stimulate their thinking and they expose them to the ideas. I talk to them about gravity. I talk to them about the motivation of other people. I talk to them about the way in which language is used in literature. We are developing a very sophisticated understanding of the relationship between formative and summative assessment and between those two things and instruction. And finally, evaluation. Now, these 5 things, aims, content, methods, assessment, and evaluation, a list developed by Michael Arrow, that's curriculum. Those things together comprise the curriculum. But I'm afraid many people just think of curriculum as number 2, the content, the list, the national curriculum. Well, the very best curriculum theory says it's all of those. And for evaluation, we can particularly look at Shanghai and Japan. Lesson study and lesson observation, which is being used so effectively in the context of the NIS schools. Those nations are committed not only to using the very best from the past, but also for extracting the very best of present teaching, because it recognizes that the consciousness, the culture of young people is shifting, and that you need constantly to understand the interaction between teachers and pupils, and extract those things, and yes, in Shanghai, put them into the next edition of the textbooks. I opened a Shanghai textbook, and there were two interesting questions. And I said, well, that's interesting, where did that one come from? Oh, that came from some recent competitions for the best lessons, which the teacher researchers were involved in, and we've included in the textbook. Excellent. Where did that question come from? Oh, that was first used in 1601. It's always been a good question. It reveals children's mathematical thinking, so we've used it for 500 years. So we have all these aspects of curriculum that we can observe, and isn't it complex? We have curricular and extracurriculum elements, taught and untaught curriculum, unstated curriculum, the ethos, culture of the institution, the constructed curriculum, the reality of what happens in that classroom between the teacher and the student, with a particular model of ability, with a particular idea of how students should progress. Progression, very important. In some systems, teachers believe that children have an ability. That child is not very good at mathematics. They will progress more slowly. This child has a natural ability in mathematics. They will progress quickly. So we'll give these children a reduced curriculum. We'll give these children a very rich curriculum. Strangely enough, these kids at 16 don't know as much. Isn't that strange? You see, the model of progression actually means that these kids are systematically deprived of a rich experience in school. So it's completely unsurprising that their attainment at the age of 16 will be reduced. Bill Schmidt's work tells us that, actually, around the world, we have selective systems and we have non-selective systems. The Netherlands has a very selective system. Switzerland has a very selective system. But they both achieve quite remarkable things, actually, when you look at underneath the surface. Singapore is very selective. We have unselective systems, Shanghai, Japan. They do very well too. So there's nothing much we can conclude. So Bill Schmidt asked a very important question. He asked, what do all these high-performing systems have in common? And he found they did have something very important in common. For all the differences in the form of the education, the high-performing systems possessed curriculum coherence. All the components of the education system, the complexity of funding, the forms of school, progression, ability models, teaching practice, assessment, content, they lined up. They lined up and were mutually reinforcing. Assessment was matched to the aims. The content matched the aims. The aims reinforced the content. So I talked about naive futurology, and I said I didn't like it. I underestimated it. I understated it. I really, really, really don't like it. I don't like this constructed anxiety that we hear time and time again from futurologists. It is constructed anxiety. It says, be very, very scared of Singapore because they're really good. So listen to me. And that's very, very problematic. And some big institutions, transnational institutions, are doing the same thing. No, we need to pay attention to this complexity. And what about 21st century skills? I mean, 21st century skills like working with others, which has never been a part of humanity. Or empathizing with others, which has never been part of the human condition. I mean, that's nonsense. We're noticing them for the first time. We're understanding them through the kind of research which Gordon talked about far better. But they are not new. Most of them aren't 21st century, and most of them aren't skills either. But we do need to pay attention to the things that are in the list that I put up. Arenka Suto did a very good international scan of these frameworks. And indeed, she concluded most of them aren't 21st century and most of them aren't skills. So it leaves us with a challenge as to where we put them in the curriculum. And I heard a number of people recently, naive futurologists, say children don't need to remember anything more, they just need to be able to find it on the internet. Well, this is not meant to be upsetting, but I think it illustrates the point. If you know of a family, and we have a member of the family suffering from cognitive degeneration through Alzheimer's, you know that their memory is them. And as their memory begins to decay, you can feel them going. And when we select in medical programs for particular sets of ability, both cognitive and psychomotor, in people, it is their ability. I mean, they have it. It's not located somewhere else electronically. Yes, of course we need facility and technology, but your memory is you. And what you remember and how you synthesize it and how you reproduce it is absolutely critical. And Helena Badzi is great on this. I mean, of course, our working memory can hold between 3 and 7 things, and that's because that's the way we evolved, and we haven't been able to change that physiology. If we don't commit things to our long-term memory, which is vast and huge, then we can mess up our ability to undertake complex tasks, because our working memory is therefore clogged with the things that we actually need but we haven't remembered. And that explains a lot of breakdown in mathematical tasks amongst young children. If they haven't committed things to memory, they find access to higher order thinking extremely difficult. And that's why it was so important to hear from Singapore that rote learning shouldn't be seen as something bad and should be seen as something far more sophisticated than the thing that people say, oh, it's just rote learning in Asian settings. That's naive and unscientific. Children will not need to write in future, I have heard from some primary schools. Are you still teaching the children to write? No, not really, not in the way in which we used to. Well, that's a shame, because writing actually has a profound influence on the brain. Because learning to hold a pen or a pencil and make defined marks, which are extremely precise, actually produces a whole set of hardwiring in the brain. It also suppresses infantile movement. Infantile movement is actually correlated, high levels of infantile movement is correlated with very low attention span. And Gordon spoke about sort of rise of problems in our education system. Boy, attention deficit syndrome is certainly affecting many advanced nations. We'll not need to write in future. Derrida, the French philosopher, said, when you write something down, you objectify it. When you say something, you objectify it. Writing something down reveals your thinking to yourself. It reveals your thinking to the teacher. Boy, do kids need to write. They need to write a lot, and not just on the keyboard. And Ruth Miskin talks very powerfully about the importance of oral exposure to ideas and then expressing them in writing. The oral is a precursor to the written reinforcing cognitive development. And what's this? The importance of progression and returns analysis. If there are any employers in the room, I'm afraid I do listen to what you do, but I don't always listen to what you say. Because employers say that they want innovative, creative people, people who break the rules, people who are thinking openly about problems. But it's not what they pay for. They pay for a high level of mathematical ability. They pay for a very, very high level of conceptual development in science and in other subject disciplines, as well as being creative and being innovative and rule-conforming. And the progression and returns analysis tells a very different story to all this stuff about 21st century skills. The 21st century skills stuff from the naive futurologists. So now on to teachers. What I've said is that the curriculum is complex. What I've said is that teachers' jobs are fantastically complicated. They have to look at the behaviour of children. They have to make sure that 30 to 40 young people are attending. They have to ensure that they have the right relationship with each individual student. They need to understand the home background. They need to understand whether the child has done the work that was expected before the lesson. And so on and so on and so on. It is a huge list. And they have to do that day in, day out, with groups of children that change, with groups of children that experience things outside the classroom. John Elliott has done fantastic work on this in the audience. David Bridges has done fantastic work on this. Now, the reason I put up Max Planck is that R.K. Merton and Max Planck said, if you want a scientific revolution to occur, you just have to wait for all the old scientists to die. Now let's think about our teachers. We want to change their practice. We want to bring in, rightly, and for good reason, new approaches. So the easiest thing is just to let all the old teachers die and bring in these new approaches for the young ones. Now that's absurd. Because these older teachers, these teachers using methods of the past, are using methods which have been carefully accumulated over decades and sometimes over centuries. Their own professional practice has been developed in a very sophisticated way by them, supported by their institutions, supported by school leaders like Kuliash. In some systems like Japan, Shanghai, innovation is embedded in that professional practice. They expect to transform their practice. In other systems, they don't, and that's a problem. We have to understand teacher expertise. We have to understand the complexity of the teacher's challenge in doing an effective job and responding to the needs of young people. And this is a nice way of understanding it. When I first try to ride a bike, I don't know what I can't do, and it's a disaster. After a short period of time, I begin to know what I can't do. I can steer, but I can't steer and turn the pedals. That's why those little bikes without the pedals are so effective, because you don't need to pedal. So you're consciously incompetent. You begin to know what you can't do. And then you become okay at it, but you have to think about it all the time. Why is this powerful? We use this with medics, with surgeons, because we want surgeons to be unconsciously competent. We want them to do the right thing instantly. And we want the team to do the right thing instantly. We want huge amounts of unconscious competence. If you want to train someone, though, if you're a medic, you have to go back to being consciously competent. You have to know what it is that you do to do well. Now think about it in terms of teachers' expertise, how complex the classroom is, how complex the curriculum is. The problem is that a lot of what a good teacher really does is in that fourth category. They are unconsciously competent. After 20 years of teaching, they are really competent, but they no longer know exactly how they do it. You see, there are deeply ingrained ideas in practice, ideas about ability and progression, and practices. And the problem is that these practices are really resilient. To change them, it's like putting something into an orbit around the Earth. You have to put a lot of energy into it to change it. You have to put a lot of energy into a satellite to get it out of the gravitational pull of the Earth. To change a teacher's practice, which is so unconscious in the most part, you have to put a great deal of energy into these new approaches. And if they're really fundamental ones, for example, changing the model of ability, as they did in Finland during the 1960s, you had to put huge amounts of energy into it. There's the huge gravitational pull of habit, even when a teacher is committed to change. How many of you teacher educators in the audience have put teachers through a program? It looks as though they've changed. You then observe them again, and they're doing exactly the same thing that they always did do. It's no surprise, because unconscious competence is really important for all professions. It is, as it were, the top level of performance. And I've talked about Finland. Actually, I'm not interested in Finland in 2000, because it was already going down then, because those kids were 15 years old, and the next few tranches, we saw a decline in standards. I'm really interested in the 70s, because that's when Finland improved, after a debate in the 1940s and then in the 1950s about models of ability and progression. A big social debate about what education should consist of, and an absolute commitment to discussing it, and then agreeing on what the education system should look like, and then driving it through in a very, very interesting way. One Finn said to me, "Yep, when we changed things, it was the iron fist in the iron glove. And that's what we needed to change practice." It's not the story of Finland that you always hear. England in the 1990s is interesting because we introduced very, very well-evidenced processes of formative assessment in two areas. This is Dylan Williams' work and Paul Black's work. It was brilliantly researched. It was implemented in a series of schools, and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because of all the other incentives and drivers that were operating on the teachers. Because of deeply ingrained practices to maximize the school's attainment in respect of external measures. It was great, it was scientific, it would have improved achievement, and it didn't, because of the ingrained practice of teachers driven by a whole series of very powerful external drivers. Two more minutes. England in 2014, we've moved from levels, a very crude process of analysis, and we're finding it very difficult. The maths hubs are using evidence from Shanghai and do seem to be working. You see, to change teachers, all of these things need to be considered. Economic implications, security in the past, fear of the unknown, limited resources. To change it, we know from research you need facilitation and support, negotiation and agreement, and indeed explicit and implicit coercion. And boy, did they use that in Finland during the 1970s and 1980s. But lesson observation, Japan and Shanghai, very supportive. 3 more slides. The reason I love this is that it's an incredibly innovative way to teach fractions, and it really works. You teach all 4 functions simultaneously, deriving a very deep level of mathematical understanding amongst 7-year-olds. Where does it come from? Rongfang. It's 2,000 years old. And it informs the very best textbooks in the world in terms of maths attainment, equity, and engagement. Every Chinese household knows 100-gram tins of tea, and it's there in the textbooks. So for me, Shanghai balances the old and the new. An intense extraction from tradition, the things that work, an ability model, all will achieve, innovation based on relentless identification of good practice. And finally, Kazakhstan and mathematics. People talk about Soviet mathematics, and there's one very interesting feature of Soviet mathematics, which is an emphasis on deep understanding of mathematical principle, which is very similar to Shanghai and Rongfang, very similar to Japan. Thousands of years old in those cases. In Soviet mathematics, it's actually not Soviet. It started in the institute set up by the Tsar and became embedded in mathematics teaching in the 1960s and 1970s, and was actually emulated in some other societies around the world. Why do people not talk about Soviet mathematics? Because most of the educational researchers in the world can't read Cyrillic. So they've not accessed the research papers. What's interesting is that Kazakhstan performs well in TIMSS, very well in TIMSS, far better than you might anticipate from the PISA results. PISA results are very, very different because they're based on different sorts of items. But Kazakhstan does really well in TIMSS, atypically well. What I would argue is that in Kazakhstan, we need to understand what are these things from the past implicit in teacher pedagogy, which give rise to this kind of attainment in TIMSS. TIMSS is not just the mathematical schools. It's not the performance in the Olympiads, which we see Kazakhstan do so well in. This is performance in the normal schools. It's impressive. So to conclude, what do we need to do? We need to systematically understand the implicit elements of the existing curriculum that are of benefit. There's a problem about being middle ranking in PISA and TIMSS. Most people aren't interested in these countries. We need to view accumulated expertise as an asset. Invisible curriculum principles and practice are important. Research can make them visible. We need to analyze the curriculum features which support high attainment, and we need to develop a highly research-based implementation strategy. The good news is that's exactly what the NIS schools are doing, and that's exactly what the research groups within NIS are doing. I believe that by systematic analysis of the past, we can draw the assets through into a curriculum which absolutely meets the broad-based needs of the future. Thank you very much indeed.